Hello, YouTube. Sidekick here with another episode in the history of iron bombing, or as I'm calling it, 70 years of moving mud. In the last part of this series, no, the first part, we dealt with the European theater of operations in the Second World War. And we showed how most of the air-to-ground doctrine, at least in the West, basically grew up throughout the war. In the early part of the war, all the ground attack was the province of 2- and then 4-engine bombers dropping bombs from medium to high altitude, basically in level flight. There was no coordination between the Army and Air Force commanders. Support for the ground effort was almost accidental, except really at the very highest level. It was only as the war progressed that began to change. First, it was just a tactical doctrine that changed. The Air Forces chose missions and targets in concert with ground commanders, but the aircraft that were used were still pretty much very drawn from the bomber arm. Even in 1943, fighter aircraft were seen principally as being for the purpose of attacking other aircraft. But as those aircraft ran out of aerial opponents, or targets, both pilots and commanders started discovering other uses for them in increasingly tactical bombing roles. By the time of D-Day, the idea that fighter aircraft were an important part of the ground attack force and that it should be carried out against point targets at low altitude was actually pretty well established. Now, over the course of the rest of the campaign in Northwest Europe, air forces and ground forces started to develop techniques for a much more intimate close air support, to the point where many of the techniques that are still in use today were introduced in one form or another in 1944 and 1945 in France and Germany. We also talked about the opportunity to simulate those days in DCS, and that the ground attack aircraft at the time are reasonably well represented by the P-47 and the Mosquito FB-6, although having a Hawker Typhoon in DCS would certainly round out the stable nicely. But here's the thing. If we want to think about following the history of iron bombing after 1945, a funny thing happens. The action really does move to the other side of the planet. I mean, if you think about it, for the next 30 years or so, all of the tactical bombing that is done in Asia. The issue, of course, for DCS is that the options for simulating any of that experience are pretty limited. That's beginning to change, but still, if you look at the landscape of DCS and you're looking to simulate ground attack missions in the Pacific Theater in the Second World War, or the Korean conflict, or even Vietnam, especially in the early days, your options are, to say the least, limited. And so that's why I'm calling this episode The Missing Links. So much of what happens in the world of tactical bombing over the next 3 to 4 decades after the end of the Second World War happens in a part of the world, and featuring aircraft, that barely make an appearance in DCS. So for this video at least, there's not going to be a whole lot of DCS flying going on, because I do think it's important to talk about this stuff. There's just really no way to show you footage of simulating it. There is a little... And there is also a little bit of simulator flying, thanks to the fact that Microsoft Flight Simulator features some of the aircraft and areas that DCS does not. But be that as it may, let's continue talking about the history of iron bombing, and let's stay with World War II for the moment. But let's switch the focus to the Pacific, because it turns out there are some important differences between the Pacific and the European theater in the way ground attack developed and was used. I would say, arguably, now after having looked into it, that the experience in the Pacific had more effect on the next 20 years of air power ground attack doctrine actually than the European one did. The first thing to realize about the Pacific theater of operations is that it never enjoyed the same kind of air power resources that Europe did until really the very end of the war. And you also have to realize that Allied air forces in the Pacific theater never actually enjoyed complete air supremacy that their counterparts in Europe did until maybe the very last few months of 1945, and even then, maybe barely. But in some ways, for a bunch of reasons, air power was used in a much more integrated way and more effectively in some ways against ground targets in the Pacific almost from the beginning. Now, there's a bunch of reasons for this. First, the operations in the Pacific were just smaller, often involving single divisions of ground troops and a few fighter and bomber groups at a time, rather than army groups and air forces. So even though the planning was at the theater level, the actual commanders were much closer to the effects on the ground. Secondly, there was a degree of improvisation at the sharp end in terms of how to get the greatest effect from the aircraft that were available that was not the same as in Europe. And so, even though for the bulk of the campaign in the Pacific, the bulk of ground attack missions were flown by bombers, they weren't just used as high altitude level bombers, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Finally, even though the principal focus, or even obsession, of air commanders was with establishing air superiority, a significant portion of this mission in the Pacific consisted of attacking enemy air assets on the surface, whether that was ground or water, and not simply defeating them in the air, which is principally how they were defeated in Europe. So, ground attack tactics and doctrine developed in support of this primary mission, and not just to help ground commanders. In fact, largely because of this last effect, the most experienced and most deadly ground attack pilots on the Allied side, and certainly in, say, 1942 or 1943, were clearly in the Pacific. They were employed in either seeking enemy ships, including aircraft carriers, or destroying enemy airfields along with aircraft on the ground, and they had gotten very, very good at it. How they did it, though, largely depended on who they flew for. In the Pacific, much more than in Europe, there were actually 2 air forces. Well, kind of 3, but give me a minute. Because, you see, in the Pacific, as in Europe, the U.S. Army had an air force, and it still was the U.S. Army Air Force at the time. But the U.S. Navy also had an air force. Now, these 2 air forces had quite literally nothing in common. Well, except maybe the weapons they dropped from the aircraft in question. In the Pacific, the U.S. Army Air Force had aircraft that were basically split into 3 types. There were heavy bombers, B-17s at the start, but eventually B-24s, and these were used throughout the war pretty much as high-altitude level bombers as they were in Europe. Now, then there were medium and or light bombers, which consisted mostly of B-25s and A-20s, although there were some other random types introduced occasionally, as well as Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters and Beauforts. And it's in the employment of these aircraft that the Pacific Air Forces diverged dramatically from their European counterparts. Because while in Europe, 2-engine bombers, even those assigned to tactical air forces, were largely used as level bombers from medium or even high altitude, in the Pacific, these aircraft were used and transformed into low-altitude attack aircraft. This transformation essentially rested on the realization that for shooting up enemy aircraft on the ground, which is what they were principally interested in doing, strafing at low level was way more effective than dropping bombs from a height. So in the field, both the A-20s and the B-25s were modified by crews on the ground to basically increase the number of forward-firing machine guns they carried. Often this was done by actually removing the bomb aimer station in the nose and replacing it with multiple 50 cal machine guns and their associated ammunition that had been salvaged from other aircraft. Many B-25s in 1942 and 1943 flew into combat in the Pacific with no fewer than 8 50 cals in the nose of the aircraft. Now, once they got down on the deck to strafe their targets, other innovations for low-level attack soon followed. One of these was the discovery of skip bombing of ships, whereby instead of dropping a bomb in level flight at altitude or even in diving above the ship, the bomber would approach the ship from the side at low level and high speed. It would drop the bomb so that it skipped across the surface of the water. It would hit the ship, but being delayed fused, it would then fall below the waterline and literally blow the bottom out of the target. Another innovation was the invention of the parafrag bomb, which was really kind of the precursor maybe of today's high-drag bombs or really even maybe cluster bombs, because these parafrag bombs were small, 25-pound bombs, with parachutes attached, and they would be dropped during strafing runs over an airfield from a few hundred feet, and they would detonate with the smallest amount of impact, meaning that they often exploded above ground as they grazed structures or aircraft or even trees and bushes. Now, the Pacific Air Forces did also have their share of fighter aircraft, first of all P-40s and P-39s or P-400s, and then eventually P-38s and P-47s, and even towards the end of 1945 some P-51s. but these were almost never used in ground attack roles, at least until very, very late, well into 1944, certainly. And even then, it was often only the obsolete aircraft like the P-40s that were pressed into that role because they were basically unsuitable as high-altitude fighters. Now, towards the end of the war, during the campaign in the Philippines, some fighter units started to be used in more tactical fighter bombers, but it was still pretty limited. Now, on the other hand, the Navy's aircraft were all single-engined and designed to fly from aircraft carriers. These included, initially, the F-4F Wildcat, but by 1943 that had largely been supplanted by the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair. It also obviously included dive bombers, first the famous SBD Dauntless and then the Helldiver, although no one seemed to like the Helldiver very much, and so it kind of seems to have been replaced in carrier air wings either with more fighters or potentially with more Avengers, and the Avenger was principally originally developed to drop torpedoes, but when it ran out of enemy ships as targets, which it did in late 1944, it was also used as an effective kind of low-level tactical bomber. So for the bulk of the war, the U.S. Navy air power was focused on one of two jobs. First of all, protecting their own carriers, and second of all, sinking Japan's. Even until the end of 1945, when there were no more carriers to sink, the job of air superiority was, let's call it a bit of a preoccupation for the Navy. Now, this is partly because the Japanese kamikaze attacks proved to be so very effective during the Philippines and then particularly during Okinawa. So there really wasn't a chance for the U.S. Navy to relax about air superiority the way, to some extent, the air forces in Europe did. So although the Navy developed some significant surface attack skills throughout the war, they were mostly focused on using those skills against enemy ships or against enemy air bases, and so the Navy never really developed any doctrine or affinity for attacking ground targets in support of ground operations. But somebody did. And to understand that, you need to know that not only did the U.S. Army have an Air Force, and that the U.S. Navy had an Air Force, but you also have to appreciate that the U.S. Navy had an Army, and that Army also had an Air Force. I speak, of course, about the United States Marine Corps, which was one of the principal ground forces that was used in the Pacific theater. And in contrast to both the U.S. Army Air Force and U.S. Naval Aviation pilots in the United States Marine Corps have never been under any delusion that they exist for any other reason than to support troops on the ground, because, as the saying goes, every Marine is an infantryman first. In fact, I go so far as to say that it's only because of the Marines that any of the lessons learned about close air support during World War II survived the immediate post-war period, which is something we'll probably talk about in the next video. In contrast to both the Army and the Navy in the Pacific, the Marines put a significant amount of time, effort, and planning into getting better at providing air support to ground troops as the war went on. The United States Marine Corps experience started in 1942 in Guadalcanal, where basically a handful of Marine aviators were literally thrown ashore as soon as the Japanese airstrip on Guadalcanal, renamed Henderson Field, was captured. These aviators provided support to the hard-pressed Marines around the field, sometimes literally encountering the enemy before their gear was up. They also taught a similar handful of Army Air Force pilots who operated out of Henderson Field to do the same, by the way. If nothing else, the Guadalcanal experience taught Marine Corps aviators how they did not want to operate in the future. In particular, the Corps realized the importance of having aviation incorporated into planning, of ensuring that air assets were controlled close to the front, and that even low-level commanders needed to have some access to aviators in order to ensure coordination and responsiveness to fluid situations on the ground. All of these things are things that are taken utterly for granted today when we talk about the tactical use of air power, but in 1943, only the Corps was talking about them. The hard-won lessons of Guadalcanal, and then Tarawa, and then Peleliu, were to pay off on the Marianas in the Philippines and Iwo Jima and Okinawa later in the war. To accomplish the missions, the Marines basically flew U.S. Navy aircraft. They flew Dauntlesses and F-4Fs at the beginning, and then Corsairs, Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers as the war went on, although the Marines did seem to keep their Dauntlesses around for longer than a lot of Navy squadrons, because they were still using them to good effect in support of ground troops even in the Philippines in 1945. They also flew mostly Corsairs rather than Hellcats, as the Navy initially had significant concerns about landing the Corsair on carriers, and so had assigned them to the land-based Marine squadrons initially. As with their counterparts in the tactical Air Command fighter squadrons in Europe, Marine Corps aviators, and Air Force ground attack pilots as well, pretty much lived in the same conditions as the troops they supported, and they mostly flew out of airstrips hacked from the jungle. They lived under canvas, often surrounded by malarial swamps and clouds of mosquitoes and other insects. They ate the same rations, by and large, that the troops ate. Unlike their counterparts in Europe, though, they were often outnumbered, and they were almost never particularly well supplied, at least not until the very end of the war. Now, while Marine Corps aviators often lived and flew very close to the action, at least in the early part of the war, the Army ground attack pilots often flew hours-long missions early in the war, and those missions were often conducted over inhospitable terrain or even open ocean. Chances of survival if they didn't make it back to base were often somewhere between slim and none. Many, especially the Army Air Force pilots, flew literally hundreds of combat sorties, and the farthest they got from the front for months, some of them for even years at a time, were trips to Australia. So, although they may be less well recognized, they were also just as essential to the ultimate Allied victory. Now, when we start talking about DCS, there is one thing that you will notice about all of the aircraft, or almost all of the aircraft that I've discussed in this video so far, and that is that almost none of them are represented in DCS. I mean, the P-47 is there, but then in the Pacific it was never really used in the ground attack role, from what I can tell. Also, the A-20 is there as an AI aircraft, but in the Pacific it was principally used as a strafer, and just try to get the AI in DCS to do that for you. And of course, in terms of terrain, the only terrain that remotely resembles the Pacific theater in World War II is, of course, the Marianas map. But that provides pretty limited scope, given that it's a modern map, and much of the jungle is now covered by modern residential developments. Now, as I said, you can fly over the authentic scenery in these aircraft if you do move over to Microsoft Flight Simulator, which features models of the P-38, the Hellcat, and the Corsair, and models that are a lot of fun to fly, by the way. But in terms of iron bombing simulations of the Pacific Theater in World War II, that link, as the name of the video says, is sadly pretty much completely missing. And that effect is not actually going to get much better as we transition to the years after World War II and towards the Korean War. I mean, a lot happened after the Second World War in terms of people rethinking how to use air power, but of course, a lot of that was strongly affected by, the dropping of the atomic bombs and the way that they were, in fact, used to end the Second World War, at least with Japan. So the long and short of it is that pretty much everyone, except the Marines, completely lost their focus on tactical aviation after the war. So that even 5 years later, when the Korean War started, the whole process of figuring out how to use air power to support troops on the ground had pretty much to be rediscovered from scratch. And this time it was using aircraft, again, with the exception of the Marines, more or less, where the aircraft were even less well suited to the role than they had been at the end of the Second World War. And once again, sadly, almost none of those aircraft that spent the Korean War attacking ground targets are represented in DCS. But there's enough to talk about there that I think maybe I'll save it for the next video. So I hope you have enjoyed this next installment of 70 Years of Moving Mud. It's a project that I would like to continue with, and it will help me do that if people like the video and subscribe to the channel. So please do that. And for now, this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.